So this last part of the chapter, we're going to be talking about the cranial nerves. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They are going to innervate the periphery, and they're going to emerge from the brain and not the spinal cord. So even though they are going to emerge from the brain, they are considered peripheral, part of the peripheral nervous system. There's only one of these nerves that's actually considered part of the central nervous system, and we'll get to it. But basically, these nerves, they're going to be located on the base of the brain, so they're going to emerge right from the base of the brain. So if you're wanting to locate them, you just get a brain and you turn it upside down, and your cranial nerve should be located right at the base. They are going to be numbered using Roman numerals. So usually you can call them CN for cranial nerve, 1 through 12. Or you can just call it N for nerve, 1 through N12. I like to use CN basically because it characterizes cranial nerves. These cranial nerves, they're going to attach to the brain either near sensory areas or motor areas. So it all depends on the function of these cranial nerves to see if they're going to be sensory, if they're going to be motor, or they can be mixed too, having both sensory and motor functions to see where they're going to be attached to. So as we go on in the lecture, you're going to realize if they're going to be sensory or motor, usually or sometimes by the names. So always pay attention to the name. So let's start with our cranial nerve number 1. It's called the olfactory nerve. And olfactory is for smell, right? So if it's for smell, it means that it's a sensory. So this cranial nerve number 1 is going to have a sensory function of smell. You can see right over here how it's going to originate on the olfactory epithelium. We're going to talk more about this nerve when we get to special senses and we talk about smell. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details in this lecture because I think it makes more sense when we're talking about the special senses lecture. But this is the example where they classified this nerve as a peripheral nerve because it does look typically like a peripheral nerve, but this nerve is actually part of the cerebrum. So if you look over here, this would be your cranial nerve right over here, but they actually had to name their cranial nerve these little tiny fibers over here, okay, because they're in the periphery. So how did they initially number them? Basically on how they appear on the base of the brain. So you can see right over here at the tip of the base of the brain, so more frontal or anterior, that's your cranial nerve number 1 or your olfactory nerve. Now this nerve is also going to be attached directly to the cerebrum, so the information, once it's snipped over here through your nose, it arrives here in your olfactory nerve fibers, then it's sent through this structure that's called an olfactory bulb, and then it's passed on through the olfactory tract. And from here, it goes straight to your cerebrum. So remember I said that 95% of the information passes through the thalamus before it arrives into the cerebrum. Well, here is your exception. Okay, so this one, 5% of this information goes directly to your cerebrum. It doesn't have to pass through your thalamus like most of the information does. A few other things that you might be familiar with. You can see how these nerve fibers, they're the ones that are going to pass through the cribriform plate, if you guys remember, of the ethmoid bone. Okay, so you can see that, remember those little holes that we had on the cribriform plate? So these little holes are for your olfactory nerve to pass through them. And I guess that's it that we need to know about the olfactory nerve number 1. Now the optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2, is, like the name says, optic for sight. So that means it's part of the special sensory. And again, we're probably going to talk a little bit more when we get to special senses. But one thing that I want you to notice right over here is that part of the innervation that is on your right eye is going to maintain on the same side of the brain, and the other half is actually going to start over here, but it's going to cross over to the other side of the brain. Same thing with your left eye. So part of it stays on the same side of the brain, and the other part crosses over to the other side. So this area where they cross over is called optic chiasm. Okay, so this area right over here where they cross over is called your optic chiasm. And you can see that the optic chiasm is located right anterior to your pituitary gland. It sits right over here. This nerve, it's going to originate on the retina. And when we get to the special senses lecture of the eye, you're going to see how it originates on the retina. And the retina is going to be located on the back of the eye. So right over here is where your retina is located. So the image has to pass through all these structures of the eye before it can hit the retina and then be processed and sent through your optic nerve. And it's going to pass through your optic canal. So if you guys remember from lab where we were seeing the optic canal, that's where the optic nerve is going to pass through. And it's going to go all the way to the back of your brain, right over here, to your visual cortex, right? So in your occipital lobe. The next cranial nerve number 3, is what we call the oculomotor nerve. So like the name says, this one is going to be an easy one. So it has the function of movement. So this is the one that's going to move your eye, and it's going to move 4 of your muscles. It's going to move the superior, the inferior, the medial, and the inferior oblique. Okay, so superior, inferior, and medial rectus, and it's also going to move the inferior oblique. You can also do things like having to do with elevation of the palpebrae muscles, so elevates the palpebrae of your eye, and also some intrinsic muscles of the eye. But the ones that I want you to know are the ones that we discussed already in lecture previously. So the inferior, medial, and superior rectus, and the inferior oblique, all having to do with your ocular motor nerve. And basically that's it. I'm not going to talk about origin, and maybe I can talk about the foramen. So it's going to pass through your superior orbital fissure. Okay, so if you guys remember that little slant that we saw inside of the eye socket, that's where these nerves are going to pass through. Okay, so you can see it right over here, attaching to these muscles and then going back. The next one is your trochlear nerve. And your trochlear nerve, it also is a motor, has a motor function, and it's going to move your eye. But this time, it's going to innervate the superior oblique muscle. So you can see here your trochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 4, right over here, innervating your superior oblique muscle. And this is also going to pass through your superior orbital fissure. Now the trigeminal nerve is a little bit more complex because, like the name says, trigeminal means that it's going to have 3 main branches. So your main branches are going to be your ophthalmic branch right over here. So ophthalmic meaning that it's going to innervate your eye. Then we have this branch that we call maxillary branch. Like the name says, it's going to innervate your maxilla. And then we have a third one that comes down over here, which is your mandibular branch. So like the name says, it's going to innervate your mandible. So trigeminal is very important. It gives several innervations to your face. You can see that it goes basically after it leaves these main branches, it goes everywhere into your face, into your nose, into your mouth, okay? So because it's a big nerve, it's going to give you 2 functions. So you're going to have a sensory and a motor function for this muscle or for this nerve, okay? I guess on the next slide, it sort of gives you a little table of which are going to be mixed. If we classify them together, we call it mixed. But the ophthalmic one is what's going to give us a sensory information. The maxillary is also going to give us sensory information, and the mandibular is going to give us mixed information. So sensory and motor. Now I don't want you memorizing any of this. The only type of innervation that I want you to know is about the eye. So for now, the oculomotor nerve and the trochlear nerve. And here is our last about the movement of the eye. So the abducens nerve, which is your cranial nerve number 6, is also going to be for movement of the eye. And now it's going to elevate the last one that was missing, which is your lateral rectus muscle. And like the others that innervate the eye, this is also going to pass through the superior orbital fissure. Now the facial nerve is an interesting nerve because it's going to give you mixed sensation, so sensory and motor. The sensory is basically sensations from the face and also taste, so it's going to go to your tongue. And motor, basically, it's going to control the muscles of your face, so things like facial expression, lacrimal gland, submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. Where is it going to originate? Since it has to do with taste, it's going to originate on your taste buds, and when we get to the special senses lecture about taste, we're going to talk about taste buds, so you'll know exactly where it is, but it's located on your tongue. So that's for sensory. For motor, it's going to originate in your pons, so right below or right above the medulla oblongata. And in terms of foramen, it's going to pass through your internal acoustic meatus. So you guys should remember from previous lecture where that is. Now, the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is your cranial nerve number 8, it has, like the name says, it's going to innervate two areas, the vestibule and the cochlea. So you can see right over here, this is the vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve, and this is going to be the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. And both of them are going to pass right over here through your internal acoustic meatus. And you can see how it's going to pass inferior to your facial nerve, which is located right over here. Okay, so your vestibulocochlear nerve is going to be very close to your facial nerve. And like the name says, vestibulocochlear means that it's going to be good for hearing. And because it also includes the vestibule, that means that it's going to give us a lot of balance and equilibrium. And basically, like the name says, it's going to innervate the cochlea and the vestibule. And you can see how both of them are going to be passing through your internal acoustic canal or meatus. The next one is your glossopharyngeal nerve. And your glossopharyngeal nerve, so every time we have glosso, means tongue, okay? So it's going to be a mixed nerve, and if it's going to go to your tongue, that means it's for sensory, okay? So sensory, to detect taste, and it also goes all the way to your pharynx and your palate. Motor has to do with the pharyngeal muscles and the parotid salivary gland, which is this huge gland that's going to be located right over here on the side close to your temporal bone. Okay. The next nerve is cranial nerve number 10. Now this nerve, I think it's the most important of the nerves, basically because you can see how it starts right over here at the base of your brain, and then it goes down all the way to your stomach and your digestive tract. So it innervates several different organs, and of course, the bigger it is, the more complex it is, so it's going to have mixed function, so for sensory and for motor. When we're talking about sensory, they're all listed here. Okay, but you don't have to memorize any of this. And the motors are also listed here. I don't want you to memorize. I just want you to know that this is the most complex of the nerves, basically because it just goes all the way down to your digestive tract. Now the accessory nerve, which is your cranial nerve number 11, it has two branches. It has an internal branch, which is going to be this one right over here, and it has an external branch right over here. So the internal branch is going to give you sensation or motor, because the accessory nerve is for motor. The internal branch is going to innervate the olfactory or epithelium of the palate, the pharynx, and the larynx. And the external branch is going to innervate your sternocleidomastoid and your trapezius muscle. Okay, so all these structures are things that either you heard of, or with relation to the pharynx and the larynx, you still will hear about those structures. Now cranial nerve 12, our last cranial nerve, is the hypoglossal nerve. So remember, your hypoglossal nerve is going to pass through a structure that you guys are familiar with, which is your hypoglossal canal. So hypo, below the tongue. So it's going to pass right below the tongue. And we've heard about all these cranial nerves that give sensory information to your tongue. The hypoglossal is actually going to give you motor information. Okay, so it's going to innervate your tongue and allow it to move. This figure, I think it's interesting because it shows you all the different nerves that we talked about and where they're going to be located. So when you guys get to lab, it's going to be one of the figures that you should use to locate the cranial nerves. This next slide again is also just to show you where the cranial nerves originate, but basically the previous figure does the same job at showing you. This is a little table that contains all your cranial nerves, and it tells you if it's going to be sensory, motor, or mixed. It tells you where it's going to be passing through, and it tells you what structures it's going to be innervating. Innervation is important because a lot of the innervation information is going to tell you what's the primary function of that cranial nerve. And of course, we couldn't do cranial nerves without thinking of a few mnemonics. For the types of cranial nerves, I really like this one, but you guys can use whichever one you like. So O, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. And I would add to this is if you study continuously, right? So don't give up. And for the motor and sensory, I like this one. So some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matters most. Of course, there are several that are PG-13 rated, R rated. You guys can use whichever you want. But if you are going to use one and you're going to show it to me, make sure it's a PG rated one. At the end here, I did this little table for you to practice and try to relate the numbers with the names. And the most important thing for me are the function, if they're motor or sensory, and innervation. And I added this column here, interesting fact, because sometimes there's certain things that you can look online that will help you remember special things about these nerves that at the end will help you to remember which cranial nerves relate to which numbers and what's their main function and their innervation. Okay, but you can add whatever columns you want to add as long as you guys remember. Unfortunately, this part of the whole anatomy course is one that I'm not sure there's anything else that you can do but memorize. The best thing is for you to memorize the mnemonic, and that will probably tell you what type of cranial nerve it is and if it's a motor or a sensory nerve.